If you remember last week, we showed you how to install a water garden. Well, today we're going to tell you about some aquatic plants adapted for Oklahoma water gardens. And joining us is Mr. Chris Gabbard, nursery manager of Wildwood Garden Center in Tulsa. And Chris, welcome to Oklahoma Gardening.
Thanks for coming out today.
Now, Chris, as I understand, there's a large selection of aquatic plants. Why don't you tell us about a few of them?
Okay, there is a large selection of them. There are several categories you can go by. There's your bog plants that will stay in the shallow water of the pond, which is why we build the shelves in the pond, as you noticed in the last segment. There's also your floating plants that will float on the surface and basically not be rooted in anything. There's your deep water plants, like the lilies. And there's also your oxygenators, which should do a lot of cleaning in the pond.
Okay, and we'll talk about some specifics on those in a little bit. But also, Chris, I understand that a lot of the recommendations on how many of these types of plants to put in a pond are based on gallonage and size of a pond. So why don't we first of all talk about some formulas to help homeowners understand how to calculate the size. Now, if we wanted to figure out the gallonage of a pond, what would that formula be?
Well, we'd take the maximum width, the maximum depth, and the maximum length. We'd multiply those three together and multiply that by 7.5, which would give you cubic feet and therefore gallons in the pond.
Okay, so for example, with the water garden we just installed at our gardens, we estimate the depth about 2 feet. If we multiply that by the length of 14 times our width of 10, then times 7.5, we have about, what, 2,100 gallons?
About 2,000 gallons.
So that's a pretty good sized pond, isn't it?
Yeah, it's bigger than most ponds, but it's not extremely large.
Okay. Well, Chris, what instances would we use that number of 2,000 gallons?
We'd use that a lot for the types of filtration you would have and applying chemicals to the pond.
Okay, now I understand some garden centers use it even for like recommending
plants. Some garden centers will use that for recommending certain types of plants in there, but we use a different method.
Okay, and what is it you like to see as far as
we like to go with the oxygenators as far as the square yards of the surface.
And let's give them that formula now and how to figure out the square yards. That would be length times width divided by 9. And in our case, again, it would be 14 times 10 divided by 9 equals about 15.5 square yards. So if we have 15.5 square yards in our water garden, what recommendations then would you have on submergent plants?
Well, submerged plants, we'd put about 1 bunch per square yard. So in your case, we'd have about 15 bunches in the pond.
Okay. Now, that's one recommendation for the oxygenators. What about for floating type plants or large leaf plants that would float? What recommendation?
Floating type plants and plants that would actually shade the water surface, you would want to shade up to 60 to 70% of the water surface.
Okay. Well, Chris, now that we've kind of given some recommendations on amounts, let's clarify for the viewers a little bit more types of each of these categories. And the first one, I guess, would be deep water plants. What are deep water plants? Why are they called that, and what's so special about them?
Well, deep water plants are, one example would be the water lily, which everybody's familiar with, and it likes about 2 feet of water, which we consider deep water. The roots like to stay at the bottom.
Okay, now I understand there's tropical and hardy.
There's tropical and hardy water lilies. Most of the ones you'll find will be hardy water lilies. There are some tropicals. They tend to have larger leaves and are easily identifiable.
Okay. What about the tropicals? Do we need to bring them in during the winter?
They would need to be brought in during the winter.
Okay. Now another one we have in front is a lotus. That's also considered a deep water plant. Tell us about it a little bit.
The lotus is actually a deep water plant like the lily, except where the pad actually comes up out of the water and it has a larger pad to it. And we'd use it in larger ponds because it does get fairly big.
Okay. And again, it's considered hardy, right?
It is a hardy plant.
Okay. Now the second category is called bog plants, or another word, marginal.
Marginal plants.
What's so different about those?
These are plants that like shallow areas. That's with the shelf we mentioned earlier. Some examples would be like the duck potato here.
Okay.
And cattails is one that everybody knows
All
about.
right. And most of these types of bog plants are very aggressive, are they not?
Some types can be very aggressive.
So I guess keeping them in a container is recommended.
Keeping in a container will save you a lot of time and weeding out growth that is really unneeding.
Okay. What would be some other examples of bog plants maybe that are pretty familiar to people? Maybe just list a few that we have in our garden.
You have horsetail in your garden, which is a bog plant found in Oklahoma. The cattails is another one found a lot. Arrowhead is one that a lot of people are very familiar with right now because of the arrow-shaped leaf on it.
Okay. Now also there's some irises, but you also have found some other plants that are grown in the garden that are used in the bog area, like...
like cannas we've actually used in the water garden before too, which surprises a lot of people, but they work very well.
Okay, good. Well, that's some nice examples. And again, it's real important for people to find out if those plants are hardy or non-hardy. Okay. Now the third category of plants are oxygenators. Explain that to us.
Oxygenators would be plants that you usually don't see because they're completely submersed in the pond. The foliage stays under the water, and these are quite beneficial to the pond.
Now I understand some of them though are actually submerged and others are planted in containers.
Some will be planted in containers, some can float around freely and find their own place.
Okay. One that is freely floating, I guess, is hornwort, right?
Hornwort
Tell
is
us a
one
little
we have
secret
right
you
here.
have there.
Since this plant does not need to be potted, a lot of times we put a rubber band and a rock on it for an anchor, and we throw it in the pond. It keeps the plant at the bottom, but it still let it grow and not just float around.
All right, and I guess what, like Anacris, Sagittaria, and what's one that you have out here that's pretty popular that you said starts with a V? I can't.
Vallisneria is one that we like the looks of a lot.
Okay.
And this is one right here.
All right, this is one here. Okay, so it's actually in a container then.
Uh-huh.
All right. Now the last category is floating plants, and tell us about those.
The floating plants would be plants that actually just float around the pond like their name. They do not root anywhere. They will blow with the wind anywhere in the pond, and they're very good for taking up that 60 to 70% water surface coverage.
Okay. The most common example is?
Most common example would be the water hyacinth, which is this one, and you can see the roots hanging down on it. Obviously it flowers as well, which is very popular.
Okay.
Now this plant is a tropical plant, and most floating plants are tropical, so they will not overwinter in the pond.
Okay. And again, very aggressive, so dividing is real important.
Dividing and cleaning out as needed. If you get more than you want, just take a few out.
Well, what about container plants that are aggressive, even in the containers? What do you recommend as far as maybe division or repotting?
If you have a plant that's growing out of its container, growing a little bit more than you want, you can divide it, get rid of the excess, and start again.
About how many years is that done? Every?
Depends on the variety of plant you have. Some you might do every season, some may hold off every couple seasons.
Okay. And I understand there's not too many problems with insect pests, but occasionally maybe caterpillars or aphids. And do we spray the pesticides on the plants in the pond?
We want to keep all pesticides away from the pond for obvious reasons with the fish. You want to extract the plant and spray it at another location.
And then viewers are familiar with Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, which is a product, I guess, that is considered a little bit more tolerant.
That is a safe product you can use for caterpillars and also mosquitoes that you could spray in the pond as harmless.
Okay. Now, what about fertilizing? You've got some examples. Tell us a little bit about how to fertilize these container plants.
Well, there's a couple different types of fertilizers. One is the tablet form, which is a hard tablet, which is used for the potted plants. You can actually just stick the tablet into the plant and fertilize it that method. For the oxygenators or floating plants, there's a liquid type that can be added to the pond, and they can take it up through the water.
And Chris, you don't really recommend varying from the recommended products to you as far as using another liquid fertilizer or a granular fertilizer that we'd use in the landscape?
Now, we'd want to use a fertilizer that is cleared for pond use in fish.
Because we might have some toxic effects and hurt our fish.
There might be some problems with the fish.
Lastly, I want to ask you about algae and some problems. And like I noticed in our water pond, just gosh, within a couple of weeks after it was designed and filled with water, we had this aggressive algae bloom. Tell us about that and what we should do about it.
Well, a lot of people do have the algae bloom soon after they make the pond. And one of the most common types of algae is the single-cell algae, which actually makes the water murky where you cannot see into it. And how we clear that up is adding the different kinds of plants at the rates that we mentioned earlier, and that with the fish will actually balance out and keep the water clear.
Now, in addition to the plants, also to get that balance, I guess, is applying the fish or incorporating the fish.
Yes, being a complete ecosystem, the fish and the plants, everything benefits from each other, in turn will actually benefit and keep the water clear.
Well, Chris, thanks for the nice comments, and next week you can join Chris and I, and we're going to actually talk about fish and some of the maintenance and products and types of fish. And Chris, thanks again.
No problem. Thanks for coming out.